Are we okay? Yeah, okay. So good evening, everyone. Thank you for the brave people who made it through the snowstorm. And as a reward, you can have cheese and crackers and food and drinks during the whole lectures. You don't have to wait for the end. I'm Dominique Marshall. I'm the chair of the Shannon Endowment, which gives us the budget to do these lectures every year, and it's done so for more than 20 years. Uh, I'm part of the history department at Carleton University, and I would like to thank the department, the Institute of African Studies, and the Faculty of Science who have all contributed to supporting this event in addition to the Shannon Endowment. There's about 15 of us here and another 20 online, so welcome everyone. And if you haven't done it already, for those who are here, write your name on a little sticker there for the draw for our attendance prize, and everybody online is also entered, and we'll do that at the end of this meeting. We owe the Shannon Lecture Endowment to Lois Long, who is no more with us as of 3 years ago, but a long while ago gave an endowment to our department to organize this series in Canadian social history, and half of the endowment is also going towards financing scholarships for graduate students and their travel. So we're eternally grateful. So the way it's going to go today is I will give the microphone to Alexa Lepera, who is assistant curator at the Canadian Museum of Science and Technology and Ingenium in general. We'll have a microphone for the room, and I will read the questions of the audience. So Alexa, up to you.
Thank you so much, Dominique. What a great introduction. As Dominique mentioned, I'm Alexa Lepera. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the assistant curator, domestic environments and social diversity at Ingenium. I have light brown skin, short curly hair, and I'm wearing glasses today. I want to acknowledge first that the work that I do is on the unceded and unsurrendered land of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people who have lived on this land since time immemorial. I also find it important to speak to how slavery and its afterlives and histories of settler colonialism are intertwined and endure in our present day life. And I want to welcome you all to the third session of this year's Shannon Lecture Series under the theme Black Futures and Histories of Science and Technology. The speakers for this series understand technology in broad terms, ranging from the physical tools to the scientific instruments, methodological practice, and critical intervention. They offer very important insight into anti-Black racism's relationship with technology and how technology has enabled Black resistance, community building, and liberation. In broad terms, these lectures ask us to think seriously about this fluidity that exists between technology, society, and ourselves. And perhaps the questions sometimes are very linear understanding of science, technology, and innovation. Our first two sessions expanded upon methodological practice and explored histories of technology and Afrofuturism. This work continues today with our third speaker. And with that, I'd like to introduce us all to Dr. Ornella Nzindukiyimana, who teaches in the Department of Human Kinetics at St. Francis Xavier University. Ornella's research focuses on Black Canadian sport histories in the 20th century, on people and communities who found joy and community at various levels and who confronted racist ideologies both on and off the field. She's also currently the co-president of the Black Canadian Studies Association, which has been integral and played an integral role in Ingenium's Black and African Canadian Scientific and Technological Innovations Fellowship. I had the privilege of speaking with her earlier today, and I think we're all in for a really great treat this evening. So I'll leave it up to her.
Thank you so much, Alexa. And yes, I'm in a habit of often sort of walking around, so being stuck here is going to be interesting for me. But I'm very much looking forward to it. And be aware that I may sometimes do some tangents because a lot of what I'm talking about is a history of absurdity and just ridiculous things. And so sometimes I'll get caught in, just myself sort of going on a tangent, thinking about the craziness of it. I'm so grateful to be here, and just thank you so much for having me. And Alexa, I've worked with you in other capacities before this, so I'm really happy to be here with sort of meeting you actually in person for the first time. So this talks or dives into the idea of pseudo-science and racism and the ongoing impacts of these ideas on our current reality, and tries to unpack how we can possibly move beyond it. And I don't know if I have the solutions, but I definitely hope that we can start somewhere with it, exploring how these histories have us stuck in a past, and how we can use those same histories to move a bit more forward into the present. So to start off, I unpack the idea of unbecoming, informed by this quote by Frantz Fanon, that I am talking about the Black person, that they are overdetermined from without. One of African-American writer Toni Morrison's most poignant questions were, who are you without racism? Are you any good? Are you still strong? Are you still smart? Do you still like yourself? If you can only be tall because someone else is on their knees, you have a serious problem. Arguably, these apply not only to people, but also to systems that maintain racism, including sport. Metaphysically, we can break down how we, quote, see, approach, and use, end quote, the sporting body, the body in action, it's not only about kinesiology and its reactions to directives, both intrinsic and extrinsic. The sporting body also is, because it is aware of itself and others, and vice versa. As the outside gaze plays a key role in defining the meaning of the moving body in a race-determinant world, we cannot ignore the racially biased gaze upon the Black athletic body. This relational context is critical. Per Michel Foucault in Discipline and Punish, there may be a quote, there may be a knowledge of the body that is not exactly the science of its functioning, and the mastery of its forces that is more than the ability to conquer them, end quote. This succinctly summarizes the Western conceptualization of the Black athletic body and the conditions that have led to the prominent and seemingly indelible myth of the natural Black athlete. The experiences of the sporting athletic body, its interpretation, reading, labeling, categorization, and its study are all ensconced in modernity. And modernity is colonial and racial. The discursive construct of the Black body cannot be divorced from modernity any more than any analysis of any aspect of sport, from customs to structure, can be divorced from its imperial and industrial influences. This rhetoric locates the natural Black athlete, or the quote-unquote natural Black athlete, as a reductive ideation of the white gaze on a Black body that renders a phantasmagorical imagining of Blackness. As modernity is also white myth-making, the natural athlete myth cannot be exorcised without confronting racial biologicalization. The scientific framing of the racialized body of the Black athlete, primarily, though not exclusively them, likewise presents us with clear and unequivocal proof of the manufacturing and materializing of Blackness for terrible goals, to manipulate and exploit the racial other and to perpetually manifest white racial intellectual so-called supremacy. A historical link exists between race, science, health, psychology, and medicine. This idea of race has been maintained by thinkers from, quote, all walks of life, coaches, athletes, trainers, cultural anthropologists, psychologists, sociologists, physical educators, biologists, medical doctors, and sportscasters, end quote. To be clear, while the United States dominates the discussion, particularly given the prominence of the American sports system and the African-American athlete, Canada did not have to borrow a framework of hate, bigotry, and anti-Blackness. To develop this argument, I reiterate that sport is a modern Western construct to understand why we cannot dislodge white myths while also systematically insisting on dismissing experiences of racism. We need to deconstruct the dilemma of persistent discrimination and inequity in a system that insists it is not any of those things. Questioning, suspecting, and interrogating sport/modernity is therefore key to dismantling postmodern illusions. With sport, this means the ideal of meritocracy. Just as emancipation is not freedom and peace is not liberation, desegregation is not integration. I argue that the persistence of the racial interpretation of athleticism, the pseudo-science, is a science fiction that strives to absent Blackness from the future through myth. Reading the myth for what it is, a science fiction, unravels its enduring hold. As Catherine McKittrick notes, quote, thinking and writing and imagining across a range of texts, disciplines, histories, and genres unsettles suffocating and dismal and insular racial logics. From a sci-fi point of view, Black people's attempts to reclaim the narrative is doomed to fail, but there is hope nonetheless. To develop this argument, I present an overview of the various theories that undergird the natural Black athlete in the context of the colonial project of sport. I cannot cover them all individually. There's actually quite a lot of them. And then I outline the tangible consequences of this myth and offer reflection on its endurance through sci-fi narratives. I will use the term science fictions here to designate fabricated fictions in the present, and sci-fi to designate the fictional scientific histories of the future, the possible, or the imagined potential. At the turn of the 20th century, sport was the domain of the middle upper classes. As part of the British class infrastructure, this made it invariably racialized. The exclusive English public school system, where young boys trained to assume their quote-unquote rightful elite place, upheld imperial sport as a vehicle for the valued qualities of the Victorian gentleman. During the Western imperial expansion, public school graduates led the charge in the global spread of organized sport. Naturally, they structured it in the public school image, decreed who should and should not participate, upper-class men and not women, for instance, and why. For the pleasure of competition without direct monetary gain, i.e. amateurism. This definition made it difficult and near impossible for the working classes to access sport, let alone racialized peoples. Victorian notions of morality were interwoven with this link between sport and class. Through this, control and discipline of the body was an extension of control and discipline of the mind. The edicts of social Darwinism were at the root of sports attraction for eugenicists later on. Well trained in the mind and body, sporting upper-class men were to uphold the empire. Therein lay the powerful nationalist, imperialist, and racialist motivations for encouraging physical fitness. From this paradigm arose muscular Christianity, a quote, ideal of manliness and the association of physical prowess with moral virtue, unquote, and notably channeled it through organized sport. This promoted sport as a tool for preparing young men for the world, as well as in a utilitarian sense, prepared them for the battle of imbuing them with resilience in the face of hardship, value of teamwork, courage, etc. Muscular Christianity and success in sport is an inescapable phase in a characterization of the white man's manliness via physicality, character, and morality, and sport. From this notion, we can decipher how the rise of the Black athlete symbolized an existential threat to whiteness and hence to Western dominance. The rationalization that Black athletic success was not equal to equality in character, intellect, and culture was necessary to diminish and dehumanize Blackness in the popular imaginary. It was a small fiction that maintained the larger fiction of the status quo. To say that the Black athlete was only following biological impulses meant that their success did not signify effort, creativity, cleverness, intelligence, or mental toughness. Their successes were empty. The fact of explaining the Black athlete maintains the edict of Christian muscularity intact for the white society, while further stripping values and value from Black racialized people. The weight of attributing physical prowess to Black bodies lies in a discounting of their agency while attributing white bodies with agency. As Black athletes are imagined to simply be going through the motions like brutes, white athletes are construed as controlled individuals that use their bodies to achieve a well-thought-out, defined purpose in civil society. The myth of the natural Black athlete thus allowed whiteness to retain exclusive claim to humanity. Moreover, if Black athleticism meant no more than great entertainment, then it was not an argument for equality in other domains. Science, the new frontier, was as a critical tool, was used as a critical tool for reversing the force embodied by the racialized athlete, especially the champion athlete. That this science was as fictional as the construct of race that it proposed to study was only a footnote. As science was constructed through white humanity, Blackness could only be abject and object through it. So we come to the problematization of the Black body. In the mid-19th century, pseudoscientific studies of bioevolution and theories took hold. These included notions like phrenology, reading character in skull bumps, or physiognomy, reading intelligence in skull sizes. These were not merely sensationalist. They undergirded significant decisions, including, say, criminal court statements. It is in this context that in the late 19th century, German universities turned their focus on the scientific research of human performance and inspired North American physical education leaders, many of whom were medical doctors. This was the inception of a novel perspective on the study of nature, quote, attempting to create a science of research using objective and experimental methods, so the results would be unquestionably correct, end quote. To determine how to prescribe PE, physical education for health and vitality, this type of study of the body and its performance was greatly applicable. Thus, the anthropometric measurements of students to determine some kind of template for the quote-unquote average human in the late 19th century eventually turned to measurements of top athletes. Soon, athletes cemented a norm and ideal of physicality, long and lean and or wiry with muscle tone and strength. When preoccupations to improve and preserve the white race through eugenics emerged at the turn of the 20th century, anthropometrics, amongst other pseudo-scientific and scientific notions, including social Darwinism and fledgling understandings of genetics, were highly expedient. Eugenics' goal was to cull undesirable populations and achieve perfection through controlled breeding. Bodybuilding and physical fitness, personal fitness programs played into such aims. Hence, the ensuing pursuit for physical fitness to achieve the idealized physique of top white individuals' measurements went without saying. Eugenics led to research that identified supposed physical and psychological traits by racial and national groups, with, of course, the white English and German groups inevitably being deemed superior. As a result, who was researching whom mattered. The cultural norms they were working within mattered. In Canada, historians have highlighted the influence of eugenics on prominent early 20th century physical educators such as R. Tate Mackenzie. Mackenzie, a Scottish-Canadian physician and sculptor, gained notoriety for writing about restorative powers of PE and sought to use physical activity as a measure of the, quote, right race's fitness. Even his sculpting work was tinted heavily by racialist ideology. As his biography outlines, quote, from his reputation in Britain came his commission for a memory-shaping war monument in Cambridge, Homecoming. For this, he researched the smooth faces and bodies of the brave East Anglian racial type he wanted to depict, an approach now questioned as pseudo-science. The antithesis of blasted flesh and the essence of hope, the figure is the visual equivalent of the youths of the famed war poets. In the aftermath of World War I and the rise of national revolutions across the globe for the independence against the British Empire, especially, the quest for perfection, rehabilitation, and survival of the white race amped up. This manifested relatively subtly in the efforts to provide playgrounds by such figures as Canadian suffragette Mabel Peters and through Better Babies contests at fairs. More malignantly, it inspired anti-miscegenation laws and immigration control. Likewise, it manifested in the sterilization and eradication of populations deemed inferior, including the mentally and physically disabled, as well as racial minorities, Indigenous peoples being heavily targeted in Canada. The target was Indigenous peoples, non-white Europeans, and Black people. I note that despite the Black African athletes' monumental standing within the white imaginary, pseudoscientific labels do extend to other Indigenous populations. For instance, Polynesian and Samoans' success in rugby has equally been theorized as biodetermined. What is interesting in this turn is that having set up muscular Christianity and anthropometrics for white standards, any other population's athletic success holds the power to utterly collapse claims that white male athleticism is some kind of evidence of white Nordic European superior fitness. White scientists, therefore, advanced erroneous theories predicated on preserving eugenics ambitions. Critically, by the 1920s, this was already known as bad science, what we now call scientific racism. At least one scientist suggested that Black individuals and Black and white champions were more alike than they were to their so-called racial groups. After all, so-called races present more intra-racial differences than interracial ones. Logically, this discounts generalizations of entire identity-based groups. Racial mixing alone discounts any unilateral claim of Black superiority, and there is clearly nothing unique about all Black people that would certify Black athleticism in them. Biodeterminist theories were indeed called into question early in the 20th century. The Black press was clear about the socioeconomic underpinnings of Black success in sport, and some white champions, especially in boxing, acknowledged that Black champions or Black boxers were simply harder workers with more socioeconomic motivation to succeed in that domain. Note that boxing was in successive turn dominated by groups at the bottom of the social ladder, such as the Irish and the Jewish. And by the 1980s, social scientists advanced more credible theories of Black athletic success. Nevertheless, the genie could not be persuaded back in a bottle. Scientific racism had indoctrinated all manner of popular and policy texts, and its momentum could hardly be curbed. Media and common discourse played a major part in normalizing racial essentialism. By the 1930s, even as research emerged that demonstrated that racial differences could not be confirmed through anthropometry or physiology, the prevailing idea was that Black athletes' bodies were physically superior as compensation for their racial cognitive shortcomings. Hence, conceding Black athleticism, of course, this extended to all racial groups deemed lesser, including indigenous peoples, opened the door to reiterating the mediocrity of non-white people. The stage being already primed for false narratives, what was one more step outside reality, really? Science fiction's attraction, after all, its potency, is that it unfolds within the realm of the probable. So, pseudoscientific medical theories about racial differences based on biological premises have been around longer than the eugenics movement, and before even the need to justify the lucrative transatlantic slave trade and the enslavement of sub-Saharan Africans. Indeed, the color-coding of culture is traced to antiquity. By the Enlightenment period, the genotype/phenotype link was cemented. From there, Victorians introduced a sociocultural classification that repurposed the Roman label of barbarians, i.e. non-Roman others, tracing a line between the so-called savages and civilization. The Indian and the Negro colonial other operated as deviants to the white metropole. So the choice and the decision to interpret it along race along the lines of cultural differences was really unsurprising. The European imperial and colonial projects encouraged scientists to focus on the differences of populations that they encountered rather than emphasize the points of convergence. The scientists did not question whether race was anything other than biological. They did not question how one can presume to empirically compare what one cannot empirically differentiate. Instead, they sustained and legitimized the fantasy of whiteness wherein the Black person is alien, some kind of extraterrestrial to be probed, and a cyborg to be decorticated. Indeed, note the choice of skin color, a continuous genetic trait graded along a spectrum, over a discrete trait like blood type, which you have or you don't. Moving the goalpost in the case of a discrete trait, which is non-negotiable, would have not only prohibited social political structuring of racial hierarchy, but would also have prevented a smooth adjustment once made-up boundaries were inevitably debunked. And it's much harder to identify someone's blood type just on sight. Prior to sport, with little to no interpersonal contact, white people were not really compelled to formulate racializations for the Black athletic body. Yet, as amateur rules prevented most lower class people from entering the sport arena, theories abounded to explain their absence. Naturally, the rationale about sociocultural contexts was not enough. Black people were, for instance, said to be unable to excel in hockey because of weak ankles, notwithstanding the segregated yet successful teams that thrived despite being confined to the worst ice in the season. Rather, thinkers such as 19th century French racialist Arthur Comte de Gobineau drove prevailing notions that, quote, American savages like the Hindus, the Australians, and Negroes, unquote, although largely comprising of the manual labor force, regardless of gender, had lower muscle power and were, quote unquote, infinitely less able to bear fatigue. While Black boxers were understood as being capable of hitting hard, they were also described as being incapable of sustained effort. So specifically, Black boxers were supposedly weaker in the belly, meaning they could not endure body punches and would quit easily. Champion Jack Johnson taunted the person he challenged for that championship by telling him to actually punch him in the belly. Stereotypes also viewed Black people as childlike, in addition to lazy and irresponsible, something that soon transferred into stereotypes of the physically strong but cognitively inferior individual. And these stereotypes endure well beyond the Victorians. In 1895, the Encyclopedia Britannica was confident in its classification of Blackness by cranial size, abnormal arm length, low insteps, and other characteristics of the athletically inept Black body. However, by the 1900s, the success of the Black athletes forced a reconfiguration of racial categories. The Black athletes' rise meant that either the meaning of sport had to change, or the criteria for sport, success in sport had to change. The proponent of biodeterminism never addressed the paradox of a Black athlete suddenly being able to, or actually just being this physically capable, hyper-capable, super athletic being, which speaks to this innate delusion and opportunism of science. After all, the wielding of the idea of science for imperial and colonial means was contingent on the actions and need of white supremacy, not truth or positivism, as observations of the body and the movement of the body attributed from a small sample of individuals, were uncritically generalized to entire populations. The attributes of a dominant group of athletes spoke for an entire racial group entire racial groups, because the foundations of such conclusions about human anatomy in science, non-empirical though it was, helped legitimize such claims. Naturally, these went on to embed themselves in a collective imaginary. Starting in the 19th century, activities like boxing entrenched the fiction of platforming, the spectacular comparison of interracial physical abilities. Boxing embodied strength and toughness and endurance, power, masculinity. Segregating Black boxers from the space of boxing underscored their perceived threat to white superiority, especially in the higher class weights, like the heavyweights. White boxers, however, knew that this was false. They fought often and lost often to Black boxers on their ways to titles that they then get kept away from Black challengers. This trend continued into the early 1900s. Until champion Tommy Burns, a Canadian of Italian descent, famously fighting under an Anglo-Saxon name, by the way, lost the world title to African-American Jack Johnson in what one white novelist qualified as a tragedy. Famously, Johnson's successful challenge inspired a 7-year search for the great white hope who would, quote, defend the white race's athletic superiority, end quote. This moment, more than any other, led to the birth of the trope of the natural Black athlete as we understand it now, a larger than life figure that sustains the myth of race for the rest of the century, the 20th century, and into the current one. Black champions were poked and prodded, and their body became an extraordinary enigma to be solved. Biology, anatomy, physiology, psychology, and more, such studies were deployed to break down the mystery of Black advantages. No one thought to prod or test white champions so systematically, either to explicate their prowess or their so-called disadvantages. For instance, in 1901, the American champion sprint cyclist Marshall Major Taylor was x-rayed and measured by anthropologists in France, where he was competing because he could not do so in North America. Similarly, world champions Jack Johnson and Joe Louis, 22 years after him, and even other contenders in between and after, as well as track and field phenoms such as Jesse Owens, were the objects of speculative fictions about their physicality. E. Albert Kinley, a so-called X-ray specialist, claimed that Black athletes had an elongated heel bone, whereas Eleanor Metheny, a physical educator, suggested that leg length and narrow hips explain speed and strength in Black athletes, but also simultaneously suggesting that Black people's chests were too narrow as a consequence of, the long legs, and so could not do very well in endurance events. I do not believe she lived long enough to watch, Ethiopians and Kenyans. This was, of course, revised upon the rise of the those athletes of African descent in middle and long distance events. Attempts at socio-cultural determinants were just as narrow and biased. For instance, with no evidence, a clinical psychiatrist posited that Black boxers were actually attempting to make up for the restless ego vis-a-vis the superior white man. And so they were fighting it and they were just angry, and that's why they fought so hard. While an equally unproven psychological assessment declared Black people to be cooler under pressure, hence their prowess. The debates escalated post-World War II. In the late 1940s, publications such as the one by a New York Times dance critics writing on Black athleticism illustrated the popular reach of these pseudo-scientific theories of the body. Like many before and since, the critic qualified Black movement as, quote, innate and intrinsic in nature, end quote, declaring the Black dancer to be attuned to rhythm, some kind of racial rhythm. Per Miller, they, quote, went on to declare that for all their contribution to jazz and modern dance, African Americans had been wise not to take up academic ballet, for its wholly European outlook, history, and technical theory are alien to them, African Americans, culturally, temperamentally, and anatomically, end quote, end quote. Such embrace of biodeterminism permeated popular discourse through the years. You might recognize this edict in the widespread classic trope that Black people just naturally know how to dance. Under scrutiny, this is a pernicious trope. This was not only about the Black athlete either, really. Per the critics' comments on ballet, the villainy of the Black brutish body stood in very dark contrast to a spritish white body whose typology was svelte, poised, graceful, and erect. What the white athlete, quote unquote, lost to Black speed, strength, and mesomorphic advantage, they gained in stamina and mental competence, i.e., some kind of diligent forethought and application of the mind, end quote, as well as, of course, physical discipline. This was an extension of a claim on intelligence and morality, characteristics and values construed as white, Western, Protestant, and Republican that naturally not only applied to Nordic, Eastern Europeans, long excluding Catholic, Irish, Italians, Eastern Europeans, and Jewish people. The success of the Black athlete only reinforced that fallacy. Now, certainly, anti-Semitic theories in the 1930s and 40s did advance that Jewish prowess in basketball in those years was due to Jews' affinity for the trickery and scheming required for the game, as well as a short stature that provided a balanced advantage. So it was not missing, but it has been noted that when Irish, Italian, or Jewish men were dominant in certain sports, no coordinated scientific effort ensued to find the key to their prowess. Now, unsurprisingly, once Black athletes started assessing sports en masse, theories shifted accordingly. In part, this was because by the turn of the 20th century, classifying people along the lines of history, heritage, language, and other cultural markers established race as exclusively physical, targeting hypervisible, unassimilable races, while everybody else became white. Now, this, in the face of Ethiopian and Kenyan success on a track in the long-distance events, scientists like Metheny had declared them, biologically impossible, or had declared the success biologically impossible. So new theories congruent with the trending proposition that East Africans were more akin to the white race were utilized. And these are the same kinds of theories that the Belgians advanced to separate the Tutsi, the Hutu from the Tutsi in Rwanda, and that led to the tragedy of genocide against the Tutsi in 1994. So West Africans, including West Indians, Americans, and Canadians, could thus retain the so-called sprinting gene, while Easterners, by virtue of a putative higher-born ancestry, took after white svelteness. Interestingly, Jesse Owens, back in the 30s, was determined by this same logic to have had a white body type, but he was a sprinter. Now, scientific racism is, in essence, the conflation of biological characteristics observed yet not measured with fluid and convenient social and cultural constructs. Note that once Black women entered the sports scene, they encountered a form of racism entwined with misogyny, misogynoir, that it determined their sporting achievement, or diminished their sporting achievement. So the IAAF, now the World Athletics, has also only pursued racialized women, overwhelmingly Black African women, as intersex. The claims of difference never did distinctly explain athleticism. The case of Semenya from South Africa and other athletes such as, or from Burundi and Uganda have not been proven to have some kind of actual demonstrated superior athletic advantage. As Miller succinctly puts it, quote, from the vantage not so much of a later era, but of a different ideological stance, such a shift in explanations suggests that the persistence of scientific racism lay not so much in the consistency of the science, but in the constancy of its racism, end quote. Even more, the natural Black athlete isolated Black success to the sport arena, as there was no such similar claim made when Black people succeeded in other so-called cerebral domains. No entire books were published to explain Black surgeons and engineers and architects and doctorates. Today, it is obvious that Victorian principles about sports values endure. Most surprisingly, so do Victorian-era scientific concepts. The persistence of racial stereotypes appear indelible. Whenever Black athletes debunk theories, new ones inevitably emerge to perpetuate these erroneous rationalization. Now, just as Maclean's magazine set out to explain the advantages of the Black athlete in the 1960s, in the 70s, one could find a Sport Illustrated article titled Black is Best, peddling more research on the Black measurements, the bone density that is said to be at the root of Black people not being able to swim because they sink. Some ideas of metabolic structure and fat distribution and potential hormonal differences. By the 21st century, the year of the Human Genome Project concluded that racial groups are a cultural and not a biological phenomenon. A journalist published an entire book uncritically linking Black athletic superiority to, quote, a distinctive skeletal system and musculature, metabolic structures, and other characteristics forged over tens of thousands of years of evolution, end quote, nothing less. Multiple so-called scientific theories have come, but most of them have not actually gone. Scientific racism did not vanish with the repudiation of extreme manifestations of the racial other. It only expanded in scope in some cases. It formed more theories of the other based on pre-existing paradigms of the indigenous, the quote-unquote Hindus, Australian Aborigines, and the quote-unquote Negro. Figures such as my own alma mater's Western University's psychologist J. Philip Rushton were explicitly publishing about racial biodeterminism well into the 21st century, having tenure and publishing with impunity. Racial biodeterminism also manifested in all manner of ways, impacting the lives of both athletes and non-athletes alike. The narrative of the natural athlete is a cloud that hangs over us all, not only Black people, but our societies. Our collective imagination is ensnared in mythology to highly detrimental effects. What are some of these? And this is only an overview, really. Stacking can be defined as, quote, an assignment to a playing position and achieve status on the basis of an ascribed status. Stacking is a process wherein position skill theory leads to an overrepresentation of certain racial groups in certain positions, specific positions on a field. Sport has often used race as an ascriptive feature. This has been observed most in football, American football, with the sidelining of the Black North American quarterback, arguably the most central position over the course of a football match, based on the ideology that Black players have low cognitive capacity. Baseball also exhibited stacking, and studies are still coming out really showing this same phenomenon in football/soccer. In a 1993 study, Stebbins concluded that, quote, there is reason to believe that the widely accepted proposition that coaches and managers stereotype mental and physical characteristics and discriminate on that basis is still the best sociological explanation for stacking in Canadian football as in its American cousin, end quote. Stacking also operates beyond the elite and professional context, since in the mind-body binary that we have, Black people are assigned exclusively the status of body. Black men and women are overdetermined by their body and the history engraved upon it. Across the nation over many years and counting, Black recreational athletes and student athletes alike have been found to be living under the specter of the Black sporting fantastic by multiple scholars. Women, moreover, have to navigate the intersection of the myth of the Black athleticism, and the paradox of feminine athletic weakness. The scientific grounding of a bigger, stronger, brutish African body has thus crystallized a differential treatment of Black athletes both on a field and in a classroom, in high school, in university, and so on. Black athletes are over-policed by others and by themselves. They must retain control over themselves physically, emotionally, with very little room to maneuver in play and beyond. White hegemony in sport alienates Blackness and provokes dysregulation and retribution. The commodification of the Black student athlete is an especially concerning phenomenon wherein the Black student athlete is exploited and begrudgingly embraced, quote, socially, economically, and scientifically revered, end quote, all intertwined by the dismissal and undermining of their academic capacity. Itai Kudwoza's analysis about the exploitation of Black athletes in the Atlantic post-secondary institutions is especially compelling, but we're talking about the same across the country, really. Black liberation through the Black athletic figure is elusive so long as it embodies Black commodification. Further, within sport, Black athletes are historically overrepresented in the athlete role. They are absent off the field in coaching, administration, sports sciences, and sports studies of all kind. Black and people of color in general are restricted from advancing in sport and exercise medicine positions of authority across the globe. Sports sciences have reinforced the mind-body binary ethos by failing to engage with the impact of racial ideology, both in epistemology and practice. Black people are not creating knowledge about their own selves or their supposed superior inferiority. They are not the knowers and remain the subjects of study. And the debunking of racial athletic disparities is ongoing, like some kind of hydra. It grows a new head whenever one is vanquished. More concretely, it keeps Black people busy, occupied, preoccupied, anxious, and therefore, in essence, unable and incapable to simply move on to other things. The sustained hypervisibility of Black athletes also comes at the expense of other interracial encounters and epistemologies of Blackness, when non-Black people and even Black people overwhelmingly know Black people in sport. That is at the expense of an array of role models. In this framing, Black people are either artists or athletes, not really anything else. This was already evidenced in the late 20th century as tennis great Arthur Ashe and other leaders urged communities to channel kids away from sport. Ironically, the Black athlete is effectively a victim of their own success. Despite being hailed as athletically advantaged and thus physically superior, the average Black person suffers from health disparities. Ironically, anti-Black racism and systemic discrimination are cited as, quote, key drivers of health inequalities faced by diverse Black Canadian communities, end quote. And the COVID-19 pandemic very much starkly exemplified this. Research suggests that the physical prowess of Black athletes is propped up to conceal the health issues facing the wider Black population and even athletes themselves, and their vulnerability to non-communicable diseases and environmental illnesses. Indeed, quote, the media, pseudoscience, and other aspects of the sporting economy have painted a picture of superior Black physicality, leading onlookers to believe that they live in a world that does not exist, end quote. The historical link between race, science, health, psychology, and medicine is not a myth. Rather, racial essentialism manifests itself in sports science because sport health and sports science students and professionals carry enduring stereotypes about the human body and the moving body. In addition to the barriers that result in underrepresentation in the sports sciences as professionals, studies have demonstrated that systemic scientific racism in the medical field manifests in diagnosis and assessments of Black patients. One of the most prominent and dreadful ideologies pertains to the notion that Black people do not feel pain as acutely as other people. This also obfuscates Black athletes' physical and mental health issues. For instance, a 2018 American study concluded that sports staff in charge of college student athletes carried bias that Black athletes and athletes in predominantly Black sports, such as basketball versus soccer, had differential perceptions of initial pain than their counterparts. But of course, the imagined hyperphysicality of Black athletes is also found when isolated to a single sport, such as soccer. In a recently published study, really 2014, conducted in a Western Canadian context, scholars outlined how in recreational men's soccer, quote, referees rarely extended equivalent levels of protective policing to Black players themselves, resulting in frequent injuries to bodies that are supposedly immune to injury and pain. Referees thus ignore calls in Black players' favor and overwhelmingly find them at fault on a field. In this study, players experienced not only the effects of pseudoscience, but also largely were powerless to challenge them. One 42-year-old player put it plainly, quote, for the officials, they're quite harsh with Black players, right? I don't know if they think maybe we have some metallic bones or something. It all boils down to the perception of Black people. So the last chapter here tries to look to the future. Historically, for the Black athlete, sport was a question of life and death, really, both literally and socially. It was a matter of survival as Black men and women saw and continue to see sport as a means of socioeconomic mobility. Their endurance within that realm, therefore, is unsurprising. It was more urgent than it might be for other social groups, especially with the doors often consistently closed in other realms, generations after generations. As a result, the Black athlete's resilience through physical and mental hardship on a field of play must be interpreted within that context. One might ask whether sports success is determined by genetics or social cultural factors. Is it nature? Is it nurture? But no one really has the answer. This is certainly there's certainly a little bit of everything, right? The training in an optimal environment may help an individual with no genetic biological predisposition reach high levels of performance, just as a genetically predisposed individual may never reach that same optimal level without proper development. The search for what makes some champions and others is not entirely misguided. Yet history tells us that most scientific theories advanced in the last 2 centuries have been misguided by preconceived biases that correlated one single genetic phenotype and ancestry with athleticism. To ignore this history is to renege on the forging of a different future. Dislodging the Black athlete's figure from its history, whether due to ignorance, disregard, laziness, or apathy, only blindly feeds a sociocultural black hole. This is inevitable in a distorted colonial space-time continuum where we claim advancement while uncritically embracing very Victorian-era ideas and ontologies. To escape this modernist black hole and strive against these forces, powerful forces towards some event horizon, we need to be on the same page together, all of us. Fantastical stories of all kinds tell us that to dream together, we must access similar references, that is, agree on a concept of reality. Notably, Black consciousness may be an imposed concept, but crucially, it strives to repurpose the fiction of race by projecting itself into the future to imagine more than its past and definitely more than its present. I reiterate that the idea of the natural super athlete within the Black body is fashioned from the colonial European mind's conceptualization of Africa as a primitive continent. The Black individual was presumed closer to the ape, some kind of vestige of an unevolved proto-human. The same colonial mind that painted Africa as ahistorical imagined that while Europeans were engaged in rhetoric on a public forum, Africans were yet to come down from the trees. This is not something that Black people have construed about themselves, even when they participate in perpetuating this through a reimagining of the natural athlete as an empowering figure. Per Carrington, this was the, quote, logical endpoint of European colonial racism, its constitutive parts forged from a combination of pre-existing centuries-old racial folklore, religious fables, and scientific tales of the 19th century. The Black body was an object of labor and servitude when extended into entertainment and sport, it became an object of ridicule and lust. The harnessing of the Black workers' manpower was not interrupted by the myth of the Black athlete. If anything, it was enhanced. The Black sporting body as a performance spectacle remains within the realm of productivity/production, and thus retains its position as exploited matter. The only entity benefiting from the natural Black athlete is white supremacy. Now, a sci-fi reading presents an opportunity to unpack the subtext and allegories at the core of the very real science fictions of the Black athlete and offers creative revolutionary venues. After all, since race is not real, biological determinism seeks foundation in an ahistorical and therefore fictional reality meant to sustain a manufactured, fractured future. We are already in science fiction. And science fictions, these real science fictions and sci-fi itself traditionally do erase Blackness, speaking to an idealized, homogeneous, white imagined world wherein Blackness is alien and whiteness stands for humanity. Within that medium, the Black body is one-dimensional and shifts over time from the savaged and oversexed brute to the magical Negro and hyperphysical athlete. Yet it does not evolve. The Black body in sci-fi and science fiction is repressed, desired, envied, and threatening all at once. The biggest hurdle lies in Blackness's simultaneous hypervisibility and invisibility. As Catherine McKittrick qualifies Black people in Canada, it is an absented presence. This paradox is difficult to disrupt, as outlined by Rinaldo Walcott. quote, following Derrida, it is at the point of event and repetition that Black life is made both present and unbelievable. Black life generally finds itself in a repeated cycle of being spectacularized, often through visual representation in popular culture, found in sport, in music, social media, memes and GIFs, in movies, etc. At the same time, and more specifically, the state violence that is repeatedly inflicted on Black people is seen as otherworldly and somehow not believable. Through the on-brand, McKittrick qualifies Black life in all its paradoxes, mysteries, marginalizations, and material and immaterial cultural productions and unknowableness as the manifestation of refusal and resistance. McKittrick is right in qualifying this work as that of challenging, quote, the delimiting elapse of colonial space-time, end quote. It fights the foundations of racial science fictions. Succeeding in sport, once accomplished this refusal, it is time to just push it further. With the natural Black athlete, as in the sci-fi Black character, quote, the tradition and impulse to represent the Black body as strange, repulsive, or reductively sexual have only been repressed, end quote. They are not vanquished, these tropes and tendencies. As outlined through the Hydra-like theories when they became taboo and unacceptable, in their explicitness, traditional stereotypes of Blackness simply mutated both on and off screen. This has made stereotyping akin to the slips of the tongues that we can simply use plausible deniability on when they come out. The problematization of the Black sporting body and the scientific curiosity inspires only amplify its strangeness and alienness, its standing as spectacle. We see this most readily manifest in a policing of the Black female athlete, double jeopardized through race and gender. Indeed, what exactly is the logical purpose of the search of an athletic gene if not to find reason for racial differentiation? There is no attempt, after all, to find a genetic explanation for white underperformance, or so-called underperformance, if only because we do understand that underperformance is not biological. Some have attempted to reclaim the myth. They espoused the survival of the fittest theory, embracing the notion of Black athletes as evidence that only the fittest had survived the Middle Passage, for instance. As Black athletes became a beacon of racial equality, and as they rose to be hyper-visible, they became a figure of pride, one that altered the image of the Black man as indolent and shiftless into a strong, civic-minded individual espousing principles of muscular Christianity into what Miller termed muscular assimilationism. Now, the socioeconomic success of this professional Black athlete only reinforced this once we were past the amateur era. Crucially, there were also attempts to explain away the success through melanism, an idea that melanin actually captured more energy from the sun and kind of released it in sport. In this context, pseudoscience was commandeered, there was an attempt at least, for racial equality as a marker of African superiority, a scientific fiction counter-narrative, so to speak. The social and historical erasure of Blackness does power these efforts to radically project Blackness into the future. Such discourse challenges the social death of Blackness. After all, in sci-fi, Black people dream of seeing racism solved by retribution and retaliatory means, or alternatively by introducing some kind of event that turns the table. So melanism was really part of that. Melanism operates in a futurist tradition for Black people. It is an effort to reimagine and reinterpret the meaning of race through Black athletic superiority in this case, to fight fire with fire. However, what it accomplishes most of all is to entrench biodeterminism and thus legitimize these decades-long hunt for the genetic markers that justify racialist raison d'être. This is something that should have been interrupted by the conclusion of the Human Genome Project, for instance. And I argue that this is not the path to take in reclaiming the science fictions of the Black person. To paraphrase Audre Lorde, the master's tool cannot be hacked into turning on the master's own creation. Likewise, sci-fi has not been capable of really transcending common tropes when it comes to race, or often it has not been successful. It has often reneged on its promise to widely open truly new horizons to reality. So far, the limits of sci-fi in offering something new can be summarized thus. Its much touted sense of wonder for many Black readers has not infrequently given rise to a depressing sense of déjà vu, the genre proving itself more iterative than innovative in its representations of race, even when its practitioners attempt to stretch its boundaries. The natural Black athlete will not really save us, not in its current iteration. However, the raw material of the Black athlete's fiction is valuable. Storytelling itself can be hacked. This aligns with Kodo Eshun's qualification of sci-fi as a pre-programmation of the present. Imagination, daring, dreaming, these are not exclusive to the powerful. They are indeed a clear and present threat to the powerful. Note, for instance, that one of the most recent and popular forward-looking reimaginings of Black life, Black Panther, was originally created by a white man. This includes the titular character's antagonist, Killmonger, whom writer-director Ryan Coogler recast as a radical, sympathetic freedom fighter in a departure from the character's former caricature, animalistic brute self. And admittedly, the defeat of Killmonger perhaps speaks to the limits of corporate Disneyification of Black revolution. They couldn't really have him win the battle. Now, Black creatives are remarkably astute at thinking outside, quote unquote, colonial logics, both past, present, and future. After more than a century of malign fictions, this century's task is to reimagine not only the Black athlete, but ourselves, narratively and biologically as human. Reimagining requires reckoning, while reckoning requires reflection. I agree with François Cléophas in Race and the Politics of Knowledge in Sports Science when he says, quote, that reflection is also a form of mourning, a process of lamenting the continued assault on the world's colonized/oppressed people's identities and social realities. It is an important part of healing, and it leads to dreaming. Dreaming is when colonized peoples evoked their histories, worldviews, and indigenous knowledge systems to theorize and imagine alternative possibilities. In this instance, a more inclusive future for sports science methodologies is needed. Dreaming entails reimagining science to erase its fictions. Sports science epistemologies have yet to be rethought very thoroughly to build knowledges unburdened by the past. Steering away from passivity, sciences must actively platform our common humanity rather than scapegoat our barely skin-deep differences. Thank you.